Hello, in this video we will review our readings in a nutshell for Unit 4. Let me begin just with a qualifier once again for our readings. We are not presenting these readings as if we agree with everything in them. They are not Bible. We are expecting that you will agree and disagree and wrestle with them. Sometimes it's really healthy to chew on ideas that are challenging or even wrong in order to know what others are saying and to strengthen you and to engage in the dialogue. So that's what we're looking to do here. Our first reading keeps us moving through Mike Evans' book, Why Not Waste Time with God? You should have your own copy that we sent to you, so it's not linked here. If not, let us know and we will send you one. This book ties into our themes on prayer time and hearing from God. I hope you've been enjoying this read. I can't overestimate how important spending intentional time waiting on the Lord, listening in stillness is to lay the foundations for hearing from God. It's something that requires time and practice. So I encourage you to continue reading Mike's book devotionally, a section heading at a time. He has a good application in this chapter of the Akedah, Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. He shares his experience of feeling burnt out and depressed and learning to trust God more deeply. Speaking of how many people exhaust themselves with busyness, he writes, if they spent half their time with God in prayer and waiting before Him, they would find His supernatural accompaniment working mightily in their efforts. They would become passengers in the vehicle of His will, a vehicle in which He Himself is both captain and navigator. Pay particular attention to the section called Silence and Stillness. On page 74 here, Mike quotes Brendan Manning. Silence is not simply the absence of noise or the shutdown of communication with the outside world, but rather a process of coming to stillness. Silent solitude forgoes true speech. I'm not speaking of physical isolation. Solitude here means being alone with the alone, experiencing the transcendent other, and growing in awareness of one's identity as the beloved. It is impossible to know another person intimately without spending time together. Silence makes this solitude a reality. It has been said, silence is solitude practiced in action. Silence is especially difficult because it requires discipline. It's difficult for many of us to sit in silence with the Lord. Silence makes people feel uneasy. Some people feel that they just need to have the TV on all the time in the background just to be, avoid being anxious. But the noise masks what God would do underneath and within the silence, if we can be disciplined enough to wait through it. On page 75, once we sit still in silence with Him, we will know true peace and rest. He asks from us nothing but ourselves. His desire is to create in us a place where He may come and abide, a place where our souls can find rest in Him. I've still got a long way to go, but in my experience, time with God in stillness, solitude, and silence is critical for maturing in Messiah. Next, we have a chapter from a book called To Life, a celebration of Jewish being and thinking, written by Rabbi Harold Kushner. This is a charming and very readable chapter on kashrut. I recommend reading this to help you think about some of the motivations behind keeping kosher, as well as some of the basics. On page 49, Kushner writes, one of the fundamental teachings of Judaism is that the search for holiness, for the encounter with God, is not confined to the synagogue. Everything we do can be transformed into a Sinai experience, an encounter with the sacred. The goal of Judaism is not to teach us how to escape from the profane world to the cleansing presence of God, but to teach us how to bring God into the world, how to take the ordinary and make it holy. It's a thought-provoking chapter which discusses the motivations behind kosher dietary restrictions and some eye-opening ways of viewing kashrut in a way that might be new for you. Of course, he does not present a complete picture of Christianity in the article, by the way that he relates the conversations that he has and characterizes the Christian leaders that he's speaking with. I was a little bothered by his comment in there on page 53. In my opinion, he misreads Paul. For example, he emphasized that the law does not make us sin, but brings freedom. He juxtaposes this with Christians who might say that because we're sinners, we can never live up to the law and we shouldn't even try. And he says, Jews, however, feel that we should at least give it a shot. I don't personally know any Christians who feel that because we will never be able to be perfect, we should not try at all. And I don't know any Jews who feel that they can actually live God's laws perfectly. These are all misunderstandings that we have of each other. In Romans, Paul describes how God's laws make us aware of our sin because we wouldn't know what was right from wrong if God hadn't given us a law dictating it so. This awareness of how we fall short motivates us to realize how much we're in need of God's mercy and his grace. But Paul makes it clear in Romans that doesn't mean we should try to avoid the law or not follow God's law. Heaven forbid. The more aware we are of God's grace, the more motivated we are to walk in his ways. Actually, Jews and Christians agree on this topic in many ways, especially when it comes to the ethical commandments of loving your neighbor and not committing adultery and these kinds of parts of Torah. Of course, in the Jewish experience, the entire Torah is integrated together and we don't separate these categories. What Rabbi Kushner is getting at is the idea that the law doesn't lead us to be restricted, but instead the restrictions create a framework for greater freedom. He pictures a hypothetical lunch where his non-Jewish friend watches him trying to pick something kosher out of the menu and can't find anything except a boiled egg or something. His friend assumes that he's thinking, oh, would I love to just order the ham, but that mean old God won't let me. But in fact, he says what's probably going through his mind at that moment is, isn't it incredible? Nearly 5 billion people on this planet, and God cares what I have for lunch. Another key highlight that I appreciated, it isn't that unkosher foods are intrinsically bad, toxic, or that God was trying to make Jews healthier. Instead, following limits brings eating from the ordinary into the holy. On page 54, he writes, if a Gentile walks into a fast food establishment and orders a cheeseburger, he is just having lunch. But if a Jew does the same thing, he's making a theological statement. He's declaring that he does not accept the rules of the Jewish dietary system as binding on him. But heeded or violated, the rules lift the act of lunch out of the ordinary and make it a religious matter. I think you'll enjoy reading this, and it will certainly make you think. But again, you don't have to agree with all of it in here. It's just the process of wrestling with some of these ideas that's important. Next, we're going back into the book called In the Shadow of the Temple by Oscar Scarsoni. This is a fabulous book. Last unit, we read chapter 9 on the different kinds of Judaisms in the first century. Now we're going to go back to chapter 8, actually, a chapter called The Mission to the Gentiles and the Question of Torah. This reading picks up on our early Messianic Jews in Acts topic. In a very readable way, Scarsoni lays some important foundations for understanding the dynamics in first century Messianic Jewish community. The major change they were dealing with was the calling of the Gentiles to Yeshua the Messiah. Scarsoni walks through Peter's vision to Cornelius' home, the skirmish between Peter and Paul in Galatians 2, and the two great Jerusalem Council decisions recorded in Acts 15 and Acts chapter 21. Big picture, all the apostles continued to be practicing Jews throughout the entire book of Acts. Even the Apostle Paul makes it crystal clear to the entire Jerusalem community, thousands of Jewish believers in Yeshua, that he lived and practiced as a Jew and would never teach that Jewish followers of Yeshua could give up Jewish life and identity once they became followers of the Jewish Messiah. Instead, we see the message of the good news of Messiah going out to the Gentiles. First, to the God-fearers who lived alongside the Jewish community already, and then to the pagans. The council rules that Gentiles are not required to convert and become Jews to belong to Messiah. And Paul, as the designated apostle to the Gentiles, uses language around the law in his letters that is explicitly spoken to Gentiles to help them understand how they could be saved by faith in the Messiah without having to become Jews. If the Jewish law was what saved us, all peoples would have to become Jews. But the Jewish law has never been what has saved Jews. We are all saved by the grace of God through the atoning work of Messiah Yeshua. Jewish identity is not about being saved. Jewish identity is about living out the calling and election that God has given the people of Israel as an eternal and everlasting covenant, and being in relationship with those from the nations who share in the same promise of Israel's election. The coming kingdom of God through Yeshua the Messiah, who is Lord over all, both Jew and Gentile. We'll unpack this in more detail during our next real-time class on the first Messianic Jews in Acts. This next reading in our expanded section is from Pamela Eisenbaum's book, Paul Was Not a Christian. Again, keeping with the themes of our reading from In the Shadow of the Temple. While I do not agree personally with everything in Eisenbaum's book, the title is provocative. She does not mean that Paul did not encounter Yeshua and follow him to his death. What she means is that Paul didn't convert out of Judaism into a new religion called Christianity. In fact, Christianity, as opposed to Judaism, as many understand it today, didn't exist in Paul's day. Or for the apostles in Acts. Paul was a Jew who encountered his Messiah as a Jew and remained a Jew his entire life. In this chapter called On the Contrary We Uphold the Law, Eisenbaum engages a wonderful discussion on Paul, the law and grace. And I won't go into specifics here, but if this is a topic that you have had questions on, I really encourage you to take the time to read this chapter. This is a topic that was something I wrestled with for years before I fully understood the depth of the calling that God has placed on us Messianic Jews, not just as a believer in Yeshua who has a Jewish past, but a Messianic Jew in covenantal relationship with God and with the people of Israel. This is a challenging and sometimes emotional topic for Jews, Christians, and many Messianic Jews. Jews and Christians alike have accepted Paul as the official break between Judaism and Christianity. This assumption is foundational in Jewish texts and Christian commentaries alike, and even presumed in children's Bibles, who almost unilaterally describe Saul's conversion and departure from Judaism in ways that are utterly foreign to the book of Acts. If this is new for you, it requires taking a close look at the historic lens we read the Bible through. It requires opening up some of these passages that we've read in one particular way and looking at some alternative readings that might be closer to their historical intent. So be patient. Engage with this material. Allow this to unfold in the context of our wider class, and we'll be unpacking this in some detail at our class in a couple weeks in Unit 4. And if you have any questions, shoot me a text and we can always jump on a call. Next, we have a one-page reference on Heckscher examples, just so you can see what some of those look like. Dave referenced this in his video on Kashrut, so take a look at that if you'd like. And then we return back to the Jewish Gospels once again in our expanded section this time. Really encouraging, delightful read. It's on Mark 7, and I have already taken time to unpack Mark 7 in a similar way in the video section and in our class in Unit 3. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to open that up and scan through that material. But we've already covered it in the videos. Big picture, Mark 7 is not about keeping kosher. It's about ritual hand washing. Rather than abrogating the dietary laws, Yeshua calls his disciples to keep the Torah and God's laws above the Pharisaical reformations on ritual purity. Next on our expanded list, we have a link to the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council standards on Kashrut. There is some good commentary here and explanations about Kashrut, along with the basic practice that we follow at Ruach Israel for our community events. if you would like to get started and kashrut is something that you are feeling like you want to kind of grow in a bit, take a look at the MJRC Basic Practice, and that's a great place to start. I'll just summarize that here to make it easy. First, avoid biblically forbidden foods, all pork products, shellfish, and food containing their elements. Second, begin using hechshered-only meats to avoid the biblical prohibitions of blood and slaughtering method. And then third, begin to separate meat from dairy from the same meal. The MJRC commends waiting an hour to eat dairy after meat, and one can eat meat right after eating dairy, as long as they aren't at the same table. We like to have a glass of water in between. So what we do at our table is, if we have a meat meal, then we would wait an hour before we'd have a dairy dessert, for example. Separating meat and dairy dishes and having a kosher kitchen is considered expanded practice, and there are a number of different standards that you can choose to adopt or not. Remember, this is not about feeling guilty. Think of kashrut like another treasure in the treasure chest of God's blessings for us. And lastly on our list here, we have actually the same reading from Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism that we read last unit, if you got to it. I put this here because this chapter covers both the nuts and bolts topics, Yeshua in Jewish practice and Acts and Paul. It's a rather lengthy and academic read, so I figured that some of you might like some more time to go through it if you're interested. But I will be covering much of this in the class, so if you're short on time, just listen to the videos and the classes. Well, I hope that this has been a helpful overview of our readings. Feel free to browse, look at section headings, and scan through some of the readings, read other ones more carefully, but enjoy it. So happy reading. Let me know again if you have any questions, and we'll see you in the next video.